Night had finished its work quietly, sometime during the long dark hours, while most of the settlement slept behind timber walls and heavy wool blankets. The sky had lowered its burden to the earth. Snow had fallen steadily through the darkness, soft, patient, and almost silent as it gathered across the valley. Now the storm was gone. The air above the fjord held no drifting flakes. No wind pushed along the shoreline. The clouds that had carried the snowfall had thinned into pale layers high above the mountains, leaving behind a sky that was still and faintly gray with the slow approach of morning. Across the slopes surrounding the settlement, every surface had changed. The rough outlines of rocks and frozen grasses had disappeared beneath smooth white curves. Narrow animal paths winding through the hills had softened into pale ribbons, barely visible beneath the fresh powder. Even the dark lines of the forest farther inland seemed quieter, their branches weighed down by thick clinging layers of snow that dulled their usual winter rustling. Nothing moved, and yet the most remarkable change was not what the snow had covered, but what it had taken away: sound. Heavy snowfall alters the world in ways that are difficult to notice at first. It settles gently, layer upon layer, forming countless small pockets of air between the crystals. These pockets catch vibrations, weakening them, swallowing them before they can travel far. Where voices might normally carry across open ground, they fade quickly. Where wood might creak or tools might strike against timber, the echoes disappear almost immediately. And where footsteps might once have echoed through the narrow paths between buildings, the snow waits quietly to soften every movement. The Viking settlement rested within this quiet transformation. Long houses stretched along the edge of the frozen inlet, their timber walls dark against the new snow, roofs that only yesterday showed rough planks, and patches of frost were now hidden beneath deep white blankets. The weight of the snowfall curved gently along the roof lines, smoothing the sharp angles of the buildings into soft shapes that blended with the land. Between them, the usual pathways had nearly vanished, where villagers walked each day, carrying water, hauling wood, tending animals. Only faint depressions now hinted at the roots beneath the snow. Overnight, the ground had been remade, its familiar surfaces hidden beneath layers that looked untouched and strangely delicate. Even the smaller details of daily life had disappeared into the white. Stacks of chopped firewood beside doorways now rose from low snow banks like dark islands. Fences surrounding animal pens showed only their upper rails, the lower posts buried entirely. A wooden sled leaned against one longhouse wall, half hidden beneath a soft ridge where the snowfall had gathered. Above the roofs, thin lines of smoke rose slowly from the central openings of several long houses. The smoke climbed straight upward into the cold air, unbothered by wind, forming narrow drifting columns that faded quietly into the pale morning sky. In another season, the settlement would already be stirring. Doors would open, voices would cross the space between buildings, tools would strike wood or stone, dogs would bark as they moved through the yard. But beneath fresh snowfall, morning arrives differently. The snow waits. It waits for the first step that will press into its smooth surface. It waits for the first movement that will break the stillness. And inside one of the long houses near the center of the settlement, the quiet had already begun to change. Behind the heavy wooden door, The air was dim with the low glow of embers resting in the hearth. The warmth inside had faded slowly through the night, leaving the longhouse cool but still protected from the deeper cold outside. For a while there was only the faint shifting of wool and fur, then movement. He rose carefully from his bedding, the stiffness of sleep still in his limbs as the cold of the room reached through the layers of cloth wrapped around his shoulders. The quiet inside the long house felt different this morning, softer somehow, as if the walls themselves were holding less sound than usual. He stood for a moment beside the hearth. The embers breathed faintly beneath their thin layer of ash, glowing red whenever a small current of air passed through the room. Nearby tools rested where they had been left the night before. A wooden bowl sat beside a bench. None of them made the faint sounds that often accompanied the slow waking of the household. Even indoors, the silence seemed deeper. He drew his cloak closer around his shoulders and crossed the packed earth floor with steady, unhurried steps. Beneath his boots, the surface felt firm and familiar, but the quiet followed him all the way to the door. There he paused. The wooden planks were cold beneath his hand as he lifted the latch. For a moment, the door remained closed while the morning waited quietly beyond it. Then the wood shifted with a slow, muted movement as he pulled it open and stepped out into the pale winter light, where the settlement lay covered beneath deep snow, and the silence of the morning pressed gently across the village as he stood still and listened. The cold greeted him first, not with sharp wind or biting gusts, but with a quiet, steady presence that settled slowly through the layers of wool around his shoulders and along the edges of his sleeves. The air outside the doorway felt dense and unmoving, the kind of still winter air that carried its chill without haste. For a moment he did not move. His boots rested just beyond the threshold, while the open doorway behind him released a faint thread of warmer air from the longhouse. That warmth slipped briefly past his cloak and vanished almost immediately into the pale morning. Ahead of him, the ground had changed. Where the path between buildings had been firm and uneven the day before, a new surface now stretched across the settlement. Snow lay thick and smooth, its surface lightly rippled in places where it had settled unevenly during the night. He looked down. The snow reached almost to the top edge of the worn wooden threshold, rising higher than most winter falls. Its surface held the faint blue tone that often appears in deep cold mornings, where shadow and snow mix beneath the low light of the sky. His first step pressed slowly into it. The weight of his body sank through the upper layer, and beneath his boot the snow compressed with a soft, dull sound. It was not the brittle crack that sometimes came when frost hardened the surface overnight. This was deeper, quieter, a short, muffled crunch. The sound barely carried farther than his own ears. He shifted his weight fully forward and brought the other foot down beside the first. Again the snow yielded slowly beneath him, compressing inward, forming a clear depression where the boot had passed. He paused. Usually the narrow spaces between long houses carried sound easily. Even small movements often echoed faintly against the wooden walls and roof beams. A door closing, a bucket set down, the scrape of wood against wood, these things normally traveled across the open yard and returned again from the far side, but now the space felt different. The quiet did not simply come from the absence of activity, it had weight to it. He took another step. The path ahead was no longer visible in the way it had been before the snowfall. Only the faintest shallow line suggested where people had walked the day before, but the night's accumulation had softened it almost completely. Each step required a slow lifting of the boot and a steady push forward through the snow. The surface parted beneath his weight and then settled again behind him. He listened as he moved. The sounds of his steps were there, but they faded almost instantly after they formed. No echo followed them. No hollow resonance from nearby walls returned the noise. The snow absorbed it all. He walked a few more paces away from the doorway until the longhouse stood just behind his shoulder. Its timber wall rose dark against the pale ground, the rough boards carrying small ridges of snow where the wind had pressed it during the night. Above him, the roofline curved under a thick white covering. Snow had settled across the planks in a smooth blanket, rounding the sharp edges of the roof beams. Only a narrow opening at the roof center remained visible, where a thin column of smoke drifted upward from the hearth fire inside. The smoke rose straight into the morning air. It did not bend or waver. The stillness of the air allowed it to climb in a narrow gray thread that slowly thinned as it reached the pale sky. He turned his head slightly, looking along the line of buildings that formed the center of the settlement. Other long houses stood in quiet rows beyond the yard. Their shapes appeared softened now, each roof carrying its own heavy layer of snow that curved gently along the timber structures. Some doorways remained closed, others had narrow tracks leading from them where someone had already stepped outside earlier in the morning, but even those tracks looked subdued. The impressions in the snow were deep but rounded at the edges, the powder filling inward around them so that the path did not appear sharply cut. He moved forward again. The snow along the path compressed beneath his boots with the same low sound each time his weight settled into it. The movement required patience. The deeper layers resisted slightly before giving way. He adjusted the edge of his cloak with one hand, pulling the wool closer around his neck where the cold air slipped inside. The settlement remained quiet. No voices drifted between the buildings. No tools struck wood. Even the dogs that sometimes moved freely through the yard were absent from sight. Only the faint rising smoke and the steady rhythm of his own steps marked the morning. He walked a short distance farther from the doorway and then stopped again. The snow stretched across the open ground between the long houses, forming gentle slopes where it had collected along fences, wood piles, and stacked materials beside the walls. One pile of split firewood stood nearby, half buried beneath a low drift that had gathered along its base. The upper logs remained visible, their dark ends protruding from the snow like small islands in a pale field. He listened again, somewhere beyond the buildings, very faintly. A small sound carried through the cold air, perhaps the shifting of an animal within a pen, perhaps a distant movement farther along the settlement edge, but even that sound reached him quietly, softened long before it arrived. He tilted his head slightly, trying to follow the direction of it. The sound faded almost immediately. The snow had taken most of it before it could travel far. For a moment he stood without moving, the snow beneath his boots settling slowly around the edges of his steps. Then he lifted one foot again and continued along the narrow line of the buried path, moving carefully between the longhouses while the morning remained wrapped in the deep quiet left behind by the night's snowfall. None of them made the faint sounds that often accompanied the slow waking of the household. Even indoors, the silence seemed deeper. He drew his cloak closer around his shoulders and crossed the packed earth floor with steady, unhurried steps. Beneath his boots, the surface felt firm and familiar, but the quiet followed him all the way to the door. There he paused. The wooden planks were cold beneath his hand as he lifted the latch. For a moment the door remained closed while the morning waited quietly beyond it. Then the wood shifted with a slow, muted movement as he pulled it open and stepped out into the pale winter light, where the settlement lay covered beneath deep snow and the silence of the morning pressed gently across the village as he stood still and listened. He continued along the buried path, lifting each step carefully so the snow would not catch at the edges of his boots. The settlement stretched quietly around him, the familiar space between the long houses altered just enough that the distances felt slightly different than they had the day before. Snow had softened the angles of everything. Corners where the ground once showed dark soil or hardened ice now carried smooth white curves that reflected the pale light of the morning sky. Another step sank into the powder. The sound beneath his boot remained the same low compression he had heard at the doorway, a brief muffled crunch that ended almost the moment it began. Even when he paused after each step, waiting to hear the sound carry outward, nothing returned to him. The snow held it. He shifted his weight forward again. The path he followed passed between two long houses that stood close together, their timber walls rising on either side of him like dark ridges in the white ground. Normally, this narrow space would echo small noises easily. When people walked here in colder months, the firmness of the frozen ground often sent the sound of footsteps bouncing faintly between the wooden walls. But now the ground had become soft. The snow filled the space between the buildings from wall to wall, burying the old packed earth beneath a deep cushion that absorbed each movement. He walked slowly through the narrow passage. His shoulder brushed lightly against the wool of his cloak as it shifted with his stride, but even that small movement seemed quieter than usual. The thick fabric did not rasp against the air the way it sometimes did in drier cold. Above him, the edges of both roofs carried long ridges of snow. During the night, the snowfall had settled against the beams and planks, forming gentle overhangs where the roof edges met the air. In some places, the snow had built outward slightly, hanging in rounded shapes that looked soft but heavy. He glanced upward as he passed beneath them. The white layer remained still. No small slides of snow broke away. No loose crystals fell from the roof edge. The cold air held everything in place. He emerged slowly from the narrow space between the buildings and stepped back into a wider section of the settlement yard. Here the ground opened into a broad area where paths usually crossed one another. In warmer seasons, it was where villagers carried water buckets from the nearby stream, hauled wood toward the hearths, or moved supplies between storage sheds and living spaces. Today, the surface showed little sign of those routes. Snow had covered the crossing paths almost completely. Only faint depressions beneath the powder hinted at the directions where people had walked the day before. The lines curved gently beneath the snow like shallow channels hidden under still water. He stepped onto one of those buried roots. The snow here was slightly firmer than in the untouched areas beside it. Beneath the upper layer, his boot found a compacted surface where older snow and earth had been pressed together by many steps over the winter. Still, the sound remained soft. The firmer ground did not send noise outward, the way frozen soil often did. The snow above it caught the vibration before it could travel far. He continued across the yard at the same steady pace. Each step left a clear impression behind him, the edges of the boot marks rising slightly where the compressed snow pushed outward from the pressure of his weight. The marks formed a narrow line through the pale ground. He glanced back briefly. The track behind him looked almost delicate in the wide open yard, a simple chain of deep prints stretching from the longhouse doorway toward the center of the settlement. Snow crystals along the edges of each step sparkled faintly in the thin light, but even that small movement of light across the surface seemed subdued by the quiet morning. He turned forward again. Ahead of him, another row of longhouses stood facing the open yard. Their doors remained closed, though smoke drifted slowly upward from the openings in several of their roofs. The smoke rose with the same straight movement he had seen before. Without wind, it climbed gently into the sky, thinning as it rose until it became almost invisible against the pale clouds above. He slowed his steps slightly. Sometimes in the early hours of winter mornings, voices would already be carrying across this yard, someone stepping outside to gather wood, someone moving animals from one pen to another, the faint clatter of a wooden bucket or the creak of a sled being dragged across frozen ground, but the snow had changed how sound traveled here. Even if someone moved beyond one of the longhouse doors, at this moment the noise would likely reach him only faintly, softened by the layers covering the ground. He stopped walking. For a few breaths he stood quietly in the center of the yard. His cloak hung heavily from his shoulders, the wool holding the cold air along its outer folds, while the warmth from his body slowly worked outward through the fabric. His breath drifted forward in pale clouds that dissolved quickly in the still air. He listened. The settlement remained wrapped in the same strange quiet that had greeted him at the doorway. A distant movement might have stirred somewhere beyond the buildings, something subtle, perhaps the shifting of wood or the slow movement of an animal, but if it had, the snow kept most of that sound hidden within the morning. He lowered his gaze again to the ground in front of him. The surface of the snow lay smooth and slightly uneven where it had settled overnight. Small rounded shapes marked the places where buried objects rested beneath the white layer, stones, pieces of wood, or the edges of old paths that had once been visible. He lifted his foot again and resumed walking. The line of his steps continued across the yard, each one forming the same deep impression that slowly filled inward at the edges as the loose powder settled. As he moved farther along the path, the quiet did not change. It followed him through the settlement. The snow beneath his boots continued to swallow each sound he made, leaving only the slow rhythm of his movement as he walked deeper between the buildings, listening to how the village itself seemed to hold its breath beneath the heavy layers of winter. His steps carried him toward the middle of the settlement, where the open yard widened before narrowing again between another line of buildings. The snow here lay deeper than along the narrow paths near the longhouses. During the night, the wind had barely moved, and without drifting gusts to scatter the falling flakes, the snow had settled evenly across the ground. He slowed without fully realizing it. The open space encouraged stillness. In warmer months, this part of the settlement rarely remained quiet for long. People crossed here frequently, carrying tools or bundles of wood, guiding animals through temporary enclosures, or pausing briefly to speak before continuing with the work of the day. Now the space held none of that movement. The surface of the snow stretched outward in a wide pale sheet, interrupted only by a few older depressions, where paths had once been visible. The new snowfall had softened them so completely that they appeared like faint shadows beneath the powder. He stopped walking. The impressions of his boots ended behind him, marking the short distance he had crossed since leaving the longhouse. Beyond those prints, the snow remained undisturbed. He stood with his feet slightly apart, allowing the snow beneath his boots to settle fully around the edges of the leather soles. The compressed layers slowly tightened under his weight until the ground beneath him felt firmer. His cloak shifted gently as he turned his shoulders. From this place he could see more of the settlement at once. Several long houses stood arranged in familiar rows, their entrances facing inward toward the open space. The heavy snow along their roofs had rounded the sharp timber lines, giving the buildings a softened shape against the pale sky. The smoke rising from their roof openings continued to drift upward in thin gray columns. Each column moved at its own quiet pace, climbing steadily before fading into the cold air above the settlement. The smoke did not bend or wander sideways. The morning held it straight. He tilted his head slightly, listening. Normally, the center of the settlement carried small noises easily. The wooden walls surrounding the yard often caught and returned the sound of distant activity. A hammer striking wood somewhere near the edge of the village might echo faintly through the open space. A door opening or closing might carry across the yard and bounce gently from one building to another. But the snow had changed the shape of those sounds. Now, when he listened, the quiet seemed deeper than the simple absence of noise. The snow covering the ground absorbed the energy of every vibration that reached it. Each step, each shift of wood, each movement of animals or tools had to pass through those layers of soft crystals before traveling farther. Most sounds never made the journey. He turned his head slowly toward the far side of the settlement, where several low structures stood beyond the main row of long houses. The outlines of their roofs were barely visible beneath the deeper snow that had gathered along that edge of the yard. For a moment he thought he heard something, a faint movement, perhaps the slow shifting of an animal within one of the nearby enclosures. But the sound arrived so quietly that it was difficult to follow. It seemed to appear from the air itself rather than from any clear direction. He remained still, waiting to see if it would come again. The silence returned almost immediately. His breath left his mouth in slow clouds that drifted forward before dissolving in the cold air. Each exhale carried a small warmth that faded quickly as it mixed with the winter morning. The stillness around him made the movement of his breath more noticeable. Without the usual background sounds of the settlement, even the soft rhythm of breathing felt like part of the landscape. He lowered his gaze toward the snow near his boots. Small crystals along the surface caught the thin light of the sky. They formed tiny ridges where the snow had settled unevenly during the night, creating patterns that shifted gently whenever he moved his foot. He lifted one boot slightly and pressed it down again beside the previous print. The sound remained the same muted compression he had heard since stepping outside. The snow gave way slowly and then held the shape of the step after the weight settled. No echo followed. He looked across the yard once more. From here, the settlement seemed quieter than he had ever known it. Even the smoke rising from the longhouses moved so slowly that it appeared almost still against the sky. He turned his body slightly, facing toward the outer edge of the settlement, where the ground sloped gently downward beyond the last row of buildings. Another step pressed into the snow, then another. He began walking again, leaving the open center behind him while the quiet continued to settle across the village. And as he moved farther from the cluster of long houses, the faint sounds carried through the cold air became even softer, as though the snow itself were slowly drawing the settlement deeper into silence. The ground beneath his boots sloped gently as he moved toward the outer edge of the settlement. Here the buildings stood farther apart, and the snow lay thicker where fewer footsteps had crossed during the previous days. The impressions he left behind were deeper now. Each step required a slightly higher lift of the knee before the boot pressed downward again. The snow parted slowly beneath his weight, compressing in soft layers until the firmer ground below stopped the movement. The sound that followed was quiet and brief, a dull padded crunch that disappeared almost immediately into the snow around it. He walked a short distance farther and then slowed again. From this part of the settlement, the sounds of the village were usually easier to hear. When animals stirred in their pens or when someone split wood beside a longhouse wall, the noise often carried outward across the open ground before fading toward the hills. But the snow had softened that pattern. He stopped walking and stood with his boots half buried in the powder. The stillness around him felt wide and steady. Beyond the last row of buildings, the land stretched outward in gentle slopes that led toward the distant tree line. Snow covered the uneven ground there in smooth white curves that followed the shapes of the earth beneath. The forest beyond remained dark and quiet. Branches sagged under the weight of snow gathered during the night, their outlines blurred beneath the pale layers. In other seasons, the wind might move through those trees, shaking loose small cascades of snow or sending faint rustling sounds down the slope toward the settlement. Today nothing stirred. He listened. For a while there was only the slow movement of his own breath and the quiet pressure of the snow beneath his boots. Then, faintly, something reached him, a small sound carried through the cold air. It was distant, far enough away that the direction of it was difficult to follow. Perhaps it came from the far side of the animal enclosures where livestock rested during the winter nights, perhaps from a structure farther down the slope where tools or supplies were kept. The sound did not travel cleanly, instead, it arrived softened, as if much of it had been taken away before reaching the open ground where he stood. He tilted his head slightly, listening for the shape of it. For a moment the sound grew a little clearer, a short shifting movement, wood against wood perhaps, or the slow movement of something pressing against a fence rail beneath the snow. But before the noise could carry any farther, it faded. The snow-covered ground between him and its source had absorbed the rest. He remained still for several breaths. Often when a distant sound reached the settlement yard, it was followed by another, a repeated movement that confirmed where it had come from. But the quiet returned quickly this time, filling the open space again. He shifted his weight slightly, feeling the snow compress further beneath the soles of his boots. The pressure caused the edges of his footprints to settle inward. Loose crystals slid slowly down the sides of the impressions until the surface around them became smooth again. He turned his shoulders and looked back toward the longhouses. From here, the buildings appeared slightly smaller, their dark timber walls rising from deep snow banks that gathered along their bases. The paths he had crossed earlier now appeared as a narrow line of prints leading through the white ground toward the center of the settlement. Smoke continued to rise above the roofs. Thin gray threads climbed steadily upward before fading into the pale sky. The quiet between those buildings remained complete. No doors opened. No voices crossed the yard. Even the animals within the enclosures nearby seemed to move carefully, their sounds rarely reaching the open ground. He turned again toward the slope beyond the settlement. The snow there lay untouched. Smooth curves followed the shape of the land as it descended toward the lower ground, where the forest began. In places, the snow formed gentle ridges along buried rocks or low shrubs hidden beneath the surface. He stepped forward again. The deeper snow beside the settlement path resisted his movement slightly more than before. His boot pushed through the upper layer and sank until the packed ground below halted the motion. Another quiet compression of snow followed. He continued walking slowly along the edge of the open ground, his steps forming a new line of deep impressions beside the settlement. The cold air rested calmly around him. From time to time he paused, listening for the faint sounds that drifted through the distance, the subtle movements of life continuing within the snow-covered village. But each sound that reached him arrived softened and incomplete. The deep snowfall had changed how the settlement spoke to itself that morning. Every movement, every shifting piece of wood, every distant stir within the enclosures had to pass through the same quiet layers of snow before reaching the open air. And as he walked slowly along the outer edge of the settlement, he could hear how those layers gathered the sounds of the village and held them gently within the winter morning before letting them fade away. He moved a little farther from the line of packed footsteps that usually marked the settlement paths. Here the snow lay deeper. The surface looked smooth and untouched, its pale layer stretching outward beside the familiar route between the buildings. Only the faint rise and fall of the ground beneath hinted at the objects hidden below: stones, old roots, or the edges of older tracks buried by the night's snowfall. He paused at the edge of it. The packed path beneath his boots offered a firmer surface, the ground beneath compressed by many crossings earlier in the winter. But beyond it the snow rose slightly higher, forming a soft ridge that had gathered where the wind had briefly shifted during the night. He lifted his boot and stepped off the path. The difference was immediate. His foot sank deeper than before, the snow rising around the sides of the boot until it pressed lightly against the leather above the ankle. Beneath the surface, the snow compacted slowly, giving way in several quiet stages before the ground below stopped the movement. The sound that followed was thicker, not sharp, not brittle, but a dense compression that seemed to remain close to the place where it formed. He shifted his weight forward and brought the other foot beside it. Again the snow parted deeply beneath the step. The powder gathered around the edges of the new impression, sliding inward slightly as the layers beneath settled under the pressure of his weight. He stood still for a moment, looking down at the prints he had made. They were larger and deeper than the ones along the path. The snow inside them showed several faint layers, where the crystals had compacted against each other. Near the edges, loose powder clung to the sides of the boot mark, creating small curved ridges that caught the pale morning light. He lifted one foot slowly. The snow resisted briefly, holding the sole in place before releasing it with a quiet shifting sound as the packed layers loosened. When he placed the boot forward again, the movement produced the same deep, muffled compression. He walked a few steps like this, moving slowly through the untouched snow beside the path. Each step required more effort than walking along the compacted ground. His knees lifted higher and his boots pressed deeper before finding the firmer surface below. The rhythm of his movements slowed naturally, and the sound of each step remained close to him. Even here, away from the walls of the longhouses, the snow prevented the noise from carrying far across the settlement. He paused again. From this position, he could see the nearest row of buildings slightly behind him now, their roofs heavy with snow that curved gently along the timber beams. Along the lower edges of the walls, snow had gathered into deep banks where the falling flakes had drifted against the structures during the night. Near one wall, a stack of split firewood stood partly buried. Only the upper sections of the logs remained visible, their dark ends rising from a shallow mound of snow that had formed around the base of the pile. He turned his head slightly and listened again. A faint sound reached him from somewhere beyond the buildings, perhaps the shifting of hooves against wooden boards inside one of the nearby animal pens. The sound carried only a short distance before fading. The snow between the structures and the open ground softened it quickly, reducing the noise until it blended with the quiet air. He stepped forward once more. The snow pressed inward around his boots with the same slow compression, the powder sliding along the leather before settling into the deeper print left behind. His cloak moved lightly against his shoulders as he walked, the heavy wool shifting with each step. The fabric brushed softly against itself, though even that small movement seemed subdued in the thick stillness surrounding him. He continued a few paces farther across the deeper snow. Behind him, the line of prints formed a quiet path through the pale surface, each step separated by a slightly wider gap than those along the packed route. The deeper snow forced a slower, more deliberate stride. After several steps, he turned slightly back toward the settlement. The packed path lay only a short distance away, its shallow depressions running between the longhouses like faint lines beneath the white surface. He moved toward it again. As his boots reached the edge of the path, the snow beneath his feet grew firmer. The impressions became shallower once more, and the effort of lifting each step eased slightly. He paused there, standing with one foot on the packed root and the other still in the deeper powder beside it. For a moment he listened again. The quiet remained unchanged. The snowfall had settled across the settlement like a thick covering laid gently over every movement. Each sound that formed within the village seemed to pass through that covering before reaching the open air, and standing between the packed path and the deeper snow, he could feel how the ground itself had become part of that quiet, softening every step as he slowly turned back toward the settlement buildings and continued along the buried path between them. He stepped fully back onto the packed path. The ground beneath his boots felt firmer again, though the snow above it still softened each movement. The deeper impressions he had left in the untouched powder remained behind him, slowly settling inward as loose crystals slid along the edges of the prints. Ahead, the line of longhouses continued along the edge of the settlement. Their dark timber walls rose from banks of snow that had gathered around their bases overnight. The snow had curved gently against the planks, smoothing the uneven shapes where the ground met the buildings. He walked slowly toward them. The rhythm of his steps returned to the steady pace he had followed earlier: lift, press, settle. Each step produced the same quiet compression beneath the snow. The sound never traveled far. Above the roofs, the narrow columns of smoke still climbed upward into the pale sky. Without wind to scatter them, the smoke rose straight and calm, thinning gradually as it reached higher into the cold air. He stopped walking when he reached the edge of the open yard again. From here, the settlement stretched before him in a wide view. Several rows of longhouses faced inward toward the center of the village, their entrances partially buried beneath shallow drifts that had gathered along the doorways. The roof lines appeared heavier than the day before, the snow forming thick white layers that curved along the wooden beams beneath. In places, the snow had settled unevenly, creating gentle ridges that followed the lines of the roofs. He stood quietly, looking across the settlement. The quiet of the morning remained steady. No sudden sounds broke the stillness. No sharp noises traveled between the buildings. Even the faint movements that sometimes reached the open yard, tools shifting, wood settling, animals stirring, arrived softened by the snow before fading again. He turned slightly, letting his gaze move across the structures. Near one longhouse, a wooden sled leaned against the wall, its runners buried halfway in the snow that had drifted along the building during the night. Only the curved front of the sled remained visible above the pale surface, beside another doorway. A low fence marked the edge of an animal enclosure. The upper rails stood clear above the snow, but the lower posts had disappeared beneath the drift that had gathered along the ground. The enclosure itself lay quiet, the animals inside hidden from view by the timber walls of the nearby structure. He listened again. A faint sound reached him from that direction, soft, slow, and brief. Perhaps the shifting weight of an animal within the pen. The noise carried through the cold air only lightly before the snow-covered ground between them absorbed what remained. He remained still. His cloak hung heavily around his shoulders. its outer surface dusted with a few loose snow crystals that had fallen from the roof edges earlier. The wool held its shape against the cold, keeping the warmth of his body close beneath the layers. His breath rose slowly in pale clouds before dissolving. The quiet of the settlement seemed larger from this place. Standing near the center of the yard, he could feel how the snow had softened the entire space. The buildings, the paths, the open ground, all of it now rested beneath the same thick covering that absorbed the sounds of movement. Even the smallest noises had to travel through those layers before reaching the air. He shifted his weight slightly. The snow beneath his boots compressed again, producing the familiar dull sound that ended almost before it fully formed. Behind him, the line of prints he had left earlier crossed the yard in a narrow path. Ahead, the settlement remained still beneath the pale sky. He lifted one foot and stepped forward again. His movement carried him slowly along the packed route that curved gently between the longhouses. The path wound through the settlement yard in the same quiet line it had followed throughout the winter, though now the edges were softened by the new snow. As he walked, the roofs of the buildings passed slowly on either side of him. Snow rested thick along their upper surfaces, its weight pressing evenly across the wooden planks beneath. In a few places, the snow had begun to form small overhanging edges where the roof sloped downward toward the walls, but nothing shifted. The cold air held the snow in place. He continued along the path until the yard opened slightly ahead, where another stretch of open ground lay between the buildings. There he slowed again. The settlement rested around him beneath its heavy winter covering, and from where he stood, he could see how the snow had drawn a quiet boundary across the village, softening every step, every movement, every distant sound. For a moment he remained still in the center of that quiet space, watching the thin smoke rising above the roofs, while the snow-covered settlement held its calm beneath the pale winter sky. He remained standing for a while before moving again. The quiet of the yard had settled into a steady rhythm, the kind that made even small changes noticeable. Without the usual sounds moving through the settlement, each faint disturbance carried a clearer presence before fading again into the snow-covered ground. He turned his head slightly toward the animal enclosure he had noticed earlier. The wooden rails rose above the snow in a simple square beside one of the longhouses. Snow had gathered along the outer edge of the fence, forming a low bank that curved gently against the posts. He walked toward it at a slow, careful pace. The packed path bent slightly in that direction, guiding his steps along the same narrow line others had followed earlier in the winter. His boots pressed into the snow with the same quiet compression as before, leaving another sequence of shallow prints along the route. As he approached the enclosure, the faint sounds within it became easier to hear, not loud sounds, only the slow movements of animals shifting their weight within the pen, the muted scrape of a hoof against wood, the soft brushing of bodies moving against one another in the confined space. Each sound seemed subdued, as if it had already passed through several layers of snow before reaching the air. He stopped near the fence. The top rail rested at the height of his waist, its surface capped with a narrow ridge of snow that had gathered along the wood during the night. The rail beneath it felt solid and cold when he rested one gloved hand lightly against it. Inside the enclosure, the animals stood quietly. Their shapes moved slowly within the dim space between the longhouse wall and the fence. Their breath drifted upward in pale clouds that hung briefly in the cold air before fading. One animal shifted its weight, pressing a hoof against the wooden boards beneath the snow-covered ground. The sound reached him faintly. The snow inside the enclosure had softened the noise just as it had softened his own footsteps outside. He watched them for a moment. Their movements remained slow and patient, the way animals often moved in the deep quiet of winter mornings. No sudden motions disturbed the stillness. Each shift of their bodies produced only the smallest sounds before the quiet returned. He drew his hand back from the fence rail. A few loose snow crystals slid gently from the wood where his glove had brushed against it, falling onto the drift below with barely a sound. He stood there a little longer, listening. Beyond the enclosure, the rest of the settlement remained calm. Smoke continued to rise above the long houses in thin, steady lines, and the snow along the roofs and walls remained undisturbed. He turned slowly and began walking again along the path. The yard opened ahead of him once more, its surface smooth except for the scattered prints that crossed between the buildings. His boots pressed into the snow with the same quiet rhythm that had followed him since he stepped outside. Lift, press, settle. Behind him, the enclosure grew quieter again as the animals resumed their slow shifting within the pen. He continued between the long houses at the same unhurried pace. The buildings formed a narrow corridor ahead where the path curved gently between their timber walls. Snow rested thick along the lower edges of the planks, filling the small spaces where the ground met the wood. As he entered the corridor, the quiet seemed to deepen again. The snow beneath his boots remained soft enough to absorb the sound of each step. Even the slight brushing of his cloak against the sides of his legs produced almost no noise in the still air. He walked the length of the narrow passage until the space widened again near the center of the settlement. There he slowed. The open yard lay ahead, pale and smooth beneath the morning light. His footprints continued behind him in a faint line that traced his movement through the village. He stopped once more and listened. The settlement carried on with its quiet winter rhythm, small movements hidden behind timber walls, animals shifting within their pens, the slow rising smoke above the roofs. But the deep snow that covered the ground kept those sounds close to where they began. Standing there among the long houses, he could hear how the snowfall had changed the village itself, gathering the noises of morning and holding them softly within the wide stillness of winter. He left the enclosure behind and continued along the path between the buildings. The snow beneath his boots had begun to compact more firmly, where others had already walked earlier in the morning. Each step pressed the upper layer inward until it met the hardened ground below, producing the same soft, controlled sound that had followed him since he stepped outside. The path curved gently between two longhouses, whose timber walls rose dark and steady on either side of him. Snow had gathered along the lower edges of those walls, forming low banks that sloped outward across the ground. The snow there looked slightly denser than the fresh powder in the open yard, shaped by the slow settling of flakes against the wood during the night. He walked along the narrow corridor they formed. Above him, the roofs extended outward slightly beyond the walls, their heavy white covering rounding the edges of the planks. Small ridges had formed where the snow had built up along the seams between boards. The roofs held their weight quietly. Nothing slid from their edges. The cold air kept the layers stable. His boots moved steadily along the path, leaving another short sequence of impressions in the packed surface. The quiet compression of each step ended almost immediately after it began. Normally, this narrow passage would carry sound easily. The wooden walls often reflected small noises back and forth across the space. A footstep or the shifting of cloth might return as a faint echo between the planks. But now the snow beneath him absorbed most of it before the sound could travel. Even the walls seemed quieter, the heavy snow resting along the roofs and at the bases of the walls softened the edges of the structures. The settlement did not feel empty, only hushed, as though every building had lowered its voice. He slowed slightly as he passed the midpoint of the corridor. A faint movement reached him from somewhere nearby, not ahead, not behind. The sound seemed to drift from within one of the longhouses beside him, perhaps someone shifting inside the dim interior space, perhaps the slow movement of wood settling near a hearth where embers had burned through the night. The sound reached the outside only faintly. The snow that surrounded the building had absorbed most of it before it escaped into the open air. He paused for a moment beside the wall. The timber planks rose beside his shoulder, their surfaces rough beneath a thin dusting of frost that had formed during the colder hours before dawn. Snow clung lightly to the narrow ledges where the boards overlapped. He listened again. No second sound followed. Whatever movement had occurred inside had already settled again into stillness. He adjusted the edge of his cloak across his chest and resumed walking. The corridor opened slowly ahead of him as the two long houses ended and the settlement yard widened again. Light from the pale winter sky reflected off the snow, brightening the open ground beyond the buildings. His steps carried him out of the narrow space and back into the broader yard. Here the snow spread across the ground in smooth layers that reflected the sky above. Only a few scattered footprints crossed the surface, their edges already softening where the powder had begun to settle inward. He followed the faint curve of the path that wound through the yard. The quiet around him remained steady. Behind him, the narrow corridor between the long houses fell silent again. Ahead, the open space of the settlement waited beneath the same deep covering of snow that had reshaped every movement of the morning. His boots continued their slow rhythm along the buried path. Lift, press, settle. The snow beneath him received each step gently, holding the sound close to the ground as he walked calmly through the center of the village, while the pale winter light spread across the rooftops and the quiet of the snowfall lingered over the settlement. When he reached the center of the open yard again, his steps slowed until they stopped. The path beneath his boots curved gently through the settlement, its shallow line barely visible beneath the new snowfall. The ground around him stretched outward in a broad white surface that reflected the pale light of the morning sky. He remained standing there for a moment. The quiet felt deeper than before, not because the settlement had grown stiller, but because the longer he listened, the more clearly he noticed how the snow softened every movement that existed within it. His boots pressed firmly into the packed layer beneath the surface. The snow around their edges had settled into small ridges where the powder had been pushed outward by his weight. He did not move them. The impressions beneath him held their shape while loose crystals slowly slid inward along the sides. Around him the buildings rested in their usual places, though the snow had changed the way they appeared. The longhouses rose from the ground in softened shapes, their dark timber walls emerging from deep banks of snow gathered along their bases. Above them, the roofs carried thick white coverings that curved gently along the beams beneath. From several of those roofs, thin smoke continued to rise. The smoke moved slowly upward through the cold air, forming narrow drifting threads that faded gradually into the pale sky above the settlement. He watched those faint lines for a while. Without wind to disturb them, they climbed steadily, almost motionless against the quiet background of the morning. His breath left his mouth in small clouds that drifted forward before dissolving into the cold air. Each exhale felt slow and steady, without the usual sounds of the settlement moving around him. Even the quiet rhythm of breathing seemed more noticeable than before. He turned his head slightly, listening again, somewhere beyond the nearest longhouse. A faint movement reached him. The sound was small, perhaps the shifting of wood against wood inside a building, or the slow step of an animal moving within one of the nearby enclosures. It carried through the air only briefly. The snow between him and its source softened the noise before it could travel far across the yard. Within a moment the quiet returned again. He lowered his gaze toward the snow around his boots. The surface remained smooth except for the line of prints that crossed the yard behind him. Each footprint formed a deep oval shape in the powder, the edges of the impressions rising slightly where the snow had compressed outward. Loose crystals along those edges caught the faint morning light. He lifted one boot slightly and set it down again in the same place. The snow beneath it compressed with the familiar dull sound that had followed him since leaving the longhouse, a soft pressure, a brief muffled crunch, and then nothing. No echo traveled between the buildings. No lingering noise remained in the air. The snow took the sound and held it close to the ground. He remained still once more. Across the yard, the settlement continued its quiet morning rhythm. Smoke drifted upward from the roofs. Snow rested thick along the walls and fences. The narrow paths between buildings curved through the pale ground beneath the new snowfall. Life continued within the longhouses and enclosures, but the sounds of those movements remained hidden behind timber and snow. Standing there in the center of the yard, he could feel how the deep layers of snow had changed the settlement itself. Every sound began and ended close to where it formed. Every movement seemed to belong only to the place where it happened. The village had not fallen silent, it had simply grown quieter in a different way. He lifted his head again and looked toward the longhouse he had left earlier that morning. The path leading back toward it lay faint beneath the snow, marked only by the line of footprints he had left while crossing the yard. After a few breaths, he shifted his weight forward. His boot pressed into the snow once more, forming a new impression beside the others as he began to follow that quiet path back through the settlement, while the stillness of the snowfall continued to rest gently across the village. He followed the line of his earlier footprints. The impressions formed a narrow path through the snow, each step still clearly visible where the powder had compressed beneath his weight. Some of the edges had begun to soften slightly as loose crystals slid inward, but the shape of the track remained easy to follow. His boots settled carefully into the same prints. Doing so required less effort than crossing untouched snow. The packed layer inside each footprint supported his weight quickly, and the movement of his steps became steadier again. The sound beneath him remained soft. Even stepping into the firm impressions produced only a dull pressure in the snow before the quiet returned. He moved slowly across the yard. Behind him, the open space of the settlement remained calm beneath the pale sky. Ahead, the longhouses stood in their familiar rows, their snow-covered roofs curving gently above the dark timber walls. The building he had left earlier rested along the near edge of the yard. From this distance, its doorway appeared partially shadowed beneath the roof's overhang, while the snow along the lower walls had gathered into a thick bank that followed the length of the structure. Smoke continued to rise from the opening along the roof line. The column drifted upward without bending, fading gradually as it reached the higher air. He walked at the same steady pace. The prints he followed led him between two long houses where the path narrowed again. The snow along the edges of the buildings had formed shallow drifts that leaned gently against the timber walls. He stepped through the corridor of buildings. The snow beneath his boots compressed quietly, the sound barely noticeable within the confined space. Even here, where wooden walls once reflected small echoes, the deep snowfall had softened the movement of sound. His cloak brushed lightly against his side as he walked. The heavy wool shifted with his stride, its folds moving slowly against the cold air. The fabric carried a faint weight from the snow crystals that had settled across it earlier in the morning. He reached the end of the narrow passage and stepped back into the open section of the yard near his longhouse. The doorway stood just ahead now. The wooden planks of the door remained closed, their surface dusted lightly with frost that had formed during the colder hours before dawn. Snow rested along the base of the doorway, where the night's snowfall had gathered against the threshold. He slowed his steps as he approached. The prints he had left earlier ended near the entrance, their deeper impressions marking the place where he had first stepped into the fresh snow. He stopped beside them. The ground around the doorway looked slightly more uneven now, where his earlier steps had disturbed the smooth surface. Small ridges of powder surrounded the footprints. their edges catching the pale morning light. He stood quietly there. From this close distance, the sounds inside the longhouse were faint but present. A small shift of wood somewhere near the hearth, the quiet settling of the structure as the warmth from the embers continued to move slowly through the interior space. Those sounds reached the outside only lightly. The snow gathered around the base of the walls and across the ground absorbed much of their movement before they could travel into the open yard. He listened for a moment. Beyond the doorway, the dim interior waited, its warmth held behind the thick timber walls. Behind him, the settlement remained quiet beneath its deep covering of snow. He adjusted the edge of his cloak slightly where it rested against his shoulder. A few loose crystals of snow slid gently from the fabric and disappeared into the drift at his feet. Then he stepped closer to the doorway, his boots pressing once more into the snow beside the threshold, while the quiet of the winter morning remained settled across the village behind him. He remained just outside the doorway. The threshold stood before him, its wooden edge partly buried beneath the shallow ridge of snow that had gathered there during the night. The surface of the snow showed the marks of his earlier steps, their shapes pressed deeply into the powder where he had first emerged into the morning. He did not reach for the door yet. Instead, he stood quietly, his boots resting in the familiar impressions he had left behind. The snow beneath them had hardened slightly where the weight of his body had compressed the layers together. The cold air moved slowly around him. Without wind, it settled evenly across the yard, resting along the folds of his cloak and the edges of his sleeves. The wool held the warmth of his body beneath it, though the outer surface remained chilled by the morning air. He turned his head once more toward the settlement. From this position, the village spread outward in quiet lines of timber and snow. The longhouses stood in their rows across the yard, their roofs still carrying the thick white layers that had fallen during the night. The snow had rounded their shapes, sharp roof edges had softened into smooth curves. The dark lines of the wooden planks appeared calmer beneath the pale covering that rested above them. Thin smoke continued to rise from several roof openings. The smoke climbed slowly upward in narrow gray threads, steady and straight in the still air. As it rose higher, it became faint against the pale sky, dissolving gradually until it could no longer be seen. He watched it for a moment. The movement was so slow that it almost seemed still. Beyond the buildings, the open ground of the settlement lay quiet beneath the same deep snow that had changed the morning. The path he had followed earlier stretched faintly across the yard, marked only by the line of footprints he had left behind. Each impression had softened slightly as loose crystals settled inward along their edges. The prints remained visible but gentle. They did not cut sharply into the snow the way steps sometimes did on frozen ground. They simply rested there, quiet marks of movement across the pale surface. He listened again. The settlement carried its morning sounds in small, distant pieces, a faint shifting of animals somewhere beyond the nearest longhouse, the soft movement of wood settling within one of the buildings as the warmth of a hearth spread slowly through the timber frame. but each sound arrived softened by the snow that covered the ground. None of them traveled far. None of them broke the stillness that rested across the village. His breath moved slowly in the cold air. Each exhale formed a pale cloud that drifted forward before fading into the morning light. He lifted one hand and brushed lightly at the edge of his cloak, where a thin line of snow had gathered along the fold of the fabric. The movement sent a few loose crystals falling to the ground beside his boots. They disappeared immediately into the soft powder at the base of the doorway. He lowered his hand again. For another moment he remained standing there, looking out across the settlement, the snow-covered roofs, the quiet yard, the thin smoke rising into the pale sky. All of it rested within the same gentle silence that had followed the snowfall through the night. Nothing hurried the morning. Nothing disturbed the calm that had settled across the village. Behind him, the warmth of the longhouse waited beyond the wooden door. Before him, the settlement remained wrapped in the quiet of deep winter. He turned slowly back toward the doorway and rested his hand against the cold wood of the door, the snow beneath his boots settling softly as the stillness of the village continued to linger across the yard behind him. His hand remained resting against the wooden door. The timber felt cold beneath the glove, the surface firm and unmoving where the planks met the frame. Snow had gathered along the lower edge of the doorway, pressing lightly against the threshold where the night's snowfall had settled. For a while he did not move. The yard behind him held its quiet shape, the long houses resting beneath their thick winter covering, while thin smoke drifted upward into the pale air above the roofs. His breath moved slowly in the cold. Each exhale formed a faint cloud that slipped forward past his shoulder before dissolving into the morning light. The warmth within the longhouse reached him only faintly through the wood of the door, a quiet reminder of the embers still resting in the hearth behind it. He lifted the latch. The movement was small and deliberate. The wooden bar shifted gently beneath his hand, producing only a soft, dull sound as it moved from its resting place. Even that small noise seemed to fade quickly in the cold air around him. He pulled the door inward. The hinges turned slowly, the wood moving with a muted creak that did not travel far beyond the doorway. A narrow line of warmer air slipped outward from the dim interior, brushing against the snow at his feet before rising softly past the folds of his cloak. He stepped across the threshold. Snow pressed lightly against the edge of his boot as he moved inside, the powder breaking apart in a quiet compression beneath the sole. The interior darkness of the long house received him gradually. The dim glow of embers resting low within the hearth, spreading a soft red light across the packed earth floor. Behind him, the open doorway remained for a moment. The pale winter light from the yard reached inward only a short distance before fading into the shadows along the walls. Outside, the snow-covered settlement continued its slow mourning beneath the quiet sky. He paused just inside the doorway. The air within the long house carried the faint warmth of the hearth, mixed with the familiar stillness of the timber walls and roof beams that held the structure steady against the cold outside. The floor beneath his boots felt firm and slightly warmer than the frozen ground beyond the door. He turned and reached back toward the door. The wooden plank moved slowly as he drew it closed again. The pale light from outside narrowed to a thin line before disappearing entirely as the door settled against its frame. The latch fell back into place with a soft weight. Inside, the quiet deepened. The embers within the hearth shifted faintly, their dull glow spreading a gentle light across the room. Small shadows moved along the beams above as the warmth from the fire drifted upward through the air. He stood for a moment near the doorway. The cold that had settled along the outer folds of his cloak began to ease slightly as the warmth of the longhouse reached it. A few loose crystals of snow clung to the wool where they had fallen from the roof edges earlier in the morning. He brushed them lightly from the fabric. They fell soundlessly to the floor. Across the room, the low glow of the hearth remained steady. The coals rested beneath a thin layer of ash, their light dim but persistent, breathing faint warmth into the quiet space. He moved slowly toward them. His boots crossed the packed earth floor with measured steps that disturbed little of the stillness within the room. The heavy cloak around his shoulders shifted gently with each movement before settling again along his back. When he reached the hearth, he lowered himself carefully to the bench nearby. The wood creaked faintly beneath his weight before growing still again. For a moment he rested his hands near the edge of the warmth rising from the coals. The heat was soft and patient, spreading slowly outward through the air as the embers continued their quiet work beneath the ash. Outside the walls of the longhouse, the settlement remained beneath its deep covering of snow. The ground held the faint marks of his footsteps across the yard. The roofs carried their heavy white layers without movement. Smoke continued to rise in narrow threads above the buildings. Within the longhouse, the light remained low. The glow of the hearth reached only a short distance across the floor before fading into the dimness along the walls and beams. He sat quietly there, his breathing steady, the warmth from the embers slowly working through the cold gathered in his cloak. The world beyond the timber walls moved gently within the winter morning, but here the air remained calm and close, holding the slow rhythm of warmth and stillness inside the longhouse, and outside, the snow-covered village continued resting beneath the quiet weight of the winter sky.